Hello and welcome to another episode of Invalid Entry, and today we're going to be looking at how you can integrate Python code into Exchange through a cool library called ExchangeLib. Now I'm going to try and build out this screen here. Here we go. And also you might notice there's a camera upgrade which I've been waiting for weeks. So you might actually be able to see the back screens at this time and see those cool things going on. Now, on to the topic of today. First of all, we're talking about Exchange, but we can also be talking about MS365 because MS365 is actually like a hosted Exchange. I have worked with Exchange in the past, and I must say I prefer using MS365 because it takes a lot of the pain and effort off me and onto Microsoft to do it for you. But this sort of technique will work for other things, but you can't use ExchangeLib, use like Google or other mail server type things. Don't think of Exchange just as a mail server, think of it as a full integrated system. Now, what this library lets you do is let you treat it as if it's like the Django ORM, which basically means you have objects to interact with and sort of follow links. Rather than making API calls individually, it actually abstracts that away a little bit, say, okay, here's an account object, and look at the inbox of that account, or look at the calendar, which is one of the things I'm interested in doing. So this Exchange Web Service library, it's a really nice library. Whenever I pick up a new library, a couple of things I always do is I always look at the number of people developing for the library. I like to look at how well it's used, because generally speaking, even though it's a small library, it's got 40 people working on it or have worked on it over the time, which means it's well supported. And looking at the commit history just on the home page here, some commits are 3 years ago, some commits are like an hour ago. Also, I've noticed here the Travis commit is 2 days ago. Really good, because if they're committing to Travis, it means they're updating tests. Updating tests means that there's some level of quality. Open source project, even just for this brief glance, tells me that in 3 years they've had 1,500 commits, a whole bunch of developers. Looks like a good solid library to start from. Even if it's not perfect, this is probably better than some other libraries which may have 1 or 2 developers. The main difference is if you only have 1 or 2 developers, they're probably, and being a developer open source library, I can say, we only develop for things that we need, not necessarily for every edge case. Where you start having more developers from a variety of backgrounds, it means they are developing for more edge cases. So basically what we're going to do is we're just going to copy out the starting process of this for a moment, and I'm going to flip over to an Exchange, a Jupyter book where we can play with the Exchange. Alright, so as we get started here, I've just imported from ExchangeLib credentials. I'm on my Python 3.8 virtual env, which I pip installed the library. Installs really nice. So basically what we're going to do now is almost exactly from that little tutorial they had. Now, I'm not going to put my username and password in here. It's interesting because if you want to have a script, like a big screen script, accessing your account, there's 2 or 3 ways you could go about it. You can either have someone type the password in on... You can either hardcode the password in. You have someone type the password in every time round you run it, which could get a bit annoying. You could create a second account on your Exchange server, which you have a service password for rather than your user password, which then has read access to your calendar or something like that. There's various other tricks you can use to hide your user and password. I do put my credentials into various places, understanding the risk that's involved. So if you're going to put your password onto a hard drive, onto a disk, you've got to realise that anyone having access to that hard drive, either physically or virtually, will have access to your password. Which means if you're going to do this, you want to start thinking about encrypted hard drives, maybe not leaving it on a Raspberry Pi SD card in the middle of anywhere. Not a great idea. This one I actually type my password every time I restart the engine. The other things you can do, and we'll look at those in the future ones, where you can actually tie into your keychain, you can tie into your credential keys, you could look at different ways of authentication. I've got some really cool things actually how you can tie into keychains and things like that, which means that you can store the credential just once when you up for a session, like when I start the Pi, I can enter my password once. But even if I restart this service, it can pick up that password. There are some cool tools out there, kind of out the scope for this. At the moment, in this script at least, there's a user and password. In the plane, I've just hidden them by putting them in another file, but they're still there. If I printed it off, it would print off both user and password. And it's them in capitals because I like my settings to be old style C settings. Now that actually doesn't do anything. That won't connect to the system. It won't validate that in any way because this style of approach is there's a particular style where instead of having an object creation which takes a lot of arguments, what they do is they basically pass in a settings object. So this credentials could have credentials and other things in future, like key-based credentials, something like that. and then you just pass a credentials object in to say use this bunch of settings for that. But we're going to instantiate the account. Now, the account I want to connect to has the same email address as my username. My username is my thing. This is now just connecting on it. So I want that in there like that. I can't even spell. There we go. And auto discover equals true. Now if I don't put that on, basically it enters a bit of a weird situation where I have to provide all my Exchange server settings. Most people actually configure the auto discovery because it helps onboarding people with phones and clients. You just put your email address in and then the Microsoft clients will work it out. It does it by loading the web page for this domain. So it looks at the domain on your email, loads a particular URL or a DNS entry on that, and then follows that to find the SMTP server or the Exchange server. It's quite cool. It does mean you're basically exposing where your Exchange server is to the entire world, but they're usually not that hard to find out anyway. And also you want the ease of configuration. You don't want security by obfuscation. You actually want security by having good, strong authentication users and things like password cycling, detecting weak passwords, encouraging people to have a good password policy on their own right. So if I run that, basically it runs, and this actually does seem to connect. So unlike the ORM, which is very lazy, this actually does seem to connect. Given the amount of time it takes us to run there, that's a connection. Now from the tutorial, basically for item, it gives us an iterable. So in account.inbox.all, .order by. Now I want to order by date, time, received, like that. And I only want to get the last 10. And what we're going to do here is, I've just realised, because this is my work email, I don't necessarily know what's going to print off. So this may get blurred out in about 2 seconds. You notice here it takes quite a while to run this because it's actually doing all those interactions. And because it's not like a database which is local, it is a database which is remote away. Now these item objects are, if I go into a new cell now, print dir item, you'll actually see that it has all these properties I can now start to interact with. And because it's ORM-like, I can actually do .saves, I can do those kind of things to actually write data back to the Exchange. This is super powerful if you wanted to do something like a really powerful filtering system. So you can now take these and say, are these flags to tell me which inbox, so I could start putting my own rules in. If you don't use rules, you might as well use the Outlook rules system. But you could do really cool things like saying, actually I want to put it into a queue, I want to trigger an event, I want to do something cooler on your personal email. So this really is the start of this. So you could run this every few minutes on a cron job and say, are there any new mail that I haven't seen before? You would have to keep track of a point to say where you're up to. But that's basically it. As an Exchange library goes to interact with your email, it's really super cool. The keen eye amongst you may notice that since the previous scene and this scene, I am now looking like a drowned rat, and that's because I just did the school run and it is raining heavy. It just took the top off my light. I'm gonna it's the end of the world, it's the apocalypse, so this video may never get released because the 4 horsemen are rampaging down the street. Anyway, on with the topic. So basically one of the things you can do is start looking at your calendar, which is something I'm very interested in. I have to go get rid of that self-mode. I changed this to date time just so I don't have to worry about blurring everything out. Now one of the key things to notice here is that, at least on my Exchange server, it's giving me back the date times in UTC. As you can see here, this is +00. And that's really important to realise because I'm not on UTC at the moment. I'm on British Summer Time. In fact, even if I was, I would be on GMT, not UTC. That is a topic for another day. So what we're basically looking at right now, though, is that you have to be aware that there is sometimes a time delta, especially if in America you may want to convert those into Eastern Time, Mountain Time, Pacific Time, whatever. And that's going to be even more apparent in a second. So one of the things we're going to need to do is we need to import a few more libraries or components. The function actually takes this is EWS is Exchange Web Service date time. I think it has a particular format which isn't quite ISO standard at the back end. It doesn't seem to inherit, or it doesn't seem to be too compatible. So what we're going to do is pick a time period I'm interested in. So start equals account.default time zone dot localize, and then EWS date time dot now, like that. And that's I didn't run that, sorry. The other thing I'm going to import just very quickly is time delta. So we have time delta as well. Now, what we want to do, that should run nicely now. There we go. I want the future on the same cell. Future equals the start plus time delta days equals 1. So I get a whole day worth of information back. And again, we can interact now. So for occurrence in account.calendar.view. Now, when you look at the docs, you may want to say, actually, this should be account.filter. And the problem with that is, if you have reoccurring calendar events, they won't show up. Because when you actually say filter me entries which start here, but it actually started a year ago because it's a reoccurring event every week, it won't come up. You'll miss those reoccurring entries. So you want to say view and have that view on the data instead. At least that's what I've established. I want the start to be the start and the end to be the future. You could decide this, actually I want to look at what calendar entries they did have or whatever, and you just filter that really nicely. So this, remember, is on my account object up here. The other thing to notice is that these account objects can time out, the connection times out. So if you're running it, you might, this is nicer for cron type scripts, but if you're writing this into an application, you might actually have to build something where it catches a timeout exception and goes back in again. And then what we're going to do here is print occur. I'm actually going to copy a line in here, okay? So again, do a dir on one of those occurrences to see all the attributes you can have, because you've got people, invitees, the whole works sort of thing you do. I'm going to look at the start time of the subject, and then it will run, and it produces my events that I've got coming up. Again, notice those times are actually in UTC. Now, one of the things to notice that it actually catches things that are already started but not yet finished. So I've booked a day off. Today is my holiday. Have a day off, they said. It'll be nice weather, they said. So it actually says yes, and also at work right now there's a social stand-up that we do every day where we just sit down and have a chat about work. So they are being held open by those things. I've got a couple of other meetings in here, one tomorrow. And that's it, really. That's the nuts and bolts to getting data from the web server. That's the nuts and bolts of getting. Now, it does say, I think the document does say this is inheriting from datetime, but you can't say datetime.now. It won't allow it, so you have to use the EWS datetime. That needs to be that sub-object. You could probably cast the two together. It's just easy to do EWS datetime.now. So that's the end of the first part on really how to get data out. You could start doing things, if this was what you're interested in, you could start analysing, maybe seeing how many meetings you have a week with certain people, or interacting. I found sometimes you can get glitches in Outlook where you have too many meetings and you want to just write a bit of code to interact and delete a bunch of meetings. I had a really weird glitch where it was, one of my calendars was duplicating. I had to delete all my occurrences. Yeah, that's basically it. But what we're going to do now is how to now integrate that with the big screen sort of technology I have running behind me. So I'm just going to flip over to my code. I'm going to open up a new mode, and I'm going to add that to my debugger, and we'll see where we are then. Okay, before we start coding the big screen, the first thing to start thinking through is the layout. And you just want a sketch diagram or a wireframe of where things are going to go on the screen. Decisions you make here will give you long-term maintainability issues or not, depending on what you want to do. So when you sort of see some old computer games and realize they don't really scale, when people are trying to port computer games to a mobile and the screen resolution is different, this is really when you begin to notice how well it was originally programmed with the intention of porting it to different screen sizes. So one of the things I do, for example, is I hard code a lot of my numbers because I'm not intending on changing the screen resolution on things in future. I'm not intending to say, okay, now make it work if I turn the screen at its end and have vertical displays. I have to recode a lot of my screens for that. So the first thing I'm going to do is just say what I want is, and you can see it on the screen behind me as it rotates around, is I want there to be a really big, probably, the font size down here won't match the what we're doing, but it's Friday. It's the 25th of September. So I want that to be big at the top of the screen. And you've got to decide, do you want it to be in the middle or do you want it to be the left? when you're rendering in pygame the text onto the screen, what you actually get back, you say I want to render the text. It gives you like an image object, which is the text rendered. It actually also gives you the size of that text, and when you blit it on, it also gives you the bounding box. So one thing that's really helpful for this is that what I'm going to do is I'm then going to do event 1, a little bit bigger than that, maybe this sort of size. I'm actually going to say the date. So it's going to be like 2004. I can't remember what I decided. I think I put on. Let's see, just rotate it as I turned around. 11:05 p.m. event 1, and that's going to go there. And so what I'm then going to do. Yeah, and the reason I put this date here was because you want to know whether the event is today or tomorrow. Even though it's a 24-hour period, I could just make it just today. I could run it, say, pretend it's 9 o'clock in the morning, get the rest of the events of the day. But I actually want to know what I've got first thing in the morning. So when I'm logging off an email, I can just have a quick glance and say, yeah. Now what that's going to do is, again, I'm going to know the size of this box. So when I come to render the second one, what I'm going to do is, remember, that has a value. That's 0. Ooh, no, don't do that. This is your x coordinate, and it starts at 0 and it goes to lots. In my case, it goes to 1980 or whatever it is, and then again in the y coordinate side, it starts at 0 and then goes to lots. In this case, 1080 or whatever that is. That is 0 and that is lots. So if I know the height of this thing, when I render it, I can then basically keep a pointer. So I'm going to work out the height of this. I maybe start by going, they're all going to be 10 in, just as I pick a number out of anywhere. Maybe they're 40, maybe it's 25, whatever looks good. Now, that's where your compatibility in the future becomes wrong, because actually I don't necessarily know if I want to put something over here in the future. There's a lot of blank screen on this screen that I'm probably going to go fill. But I also don't know how long these events are. I did notice today I had a meeting to discuss the pros and cons of, and they may want to start saying, well, at that point I actually want to meet the maximum letters and word wrap. It gets really interesting when you start talking about not fixed width fonts, so M's are wider than I's, and how actually you want to word wrap correctly. Laying out typography is an interesting challenge to tackle at some point. You end up trying to box, you basically end up building each word as a separate thing, and then work out if there's space between the word or do I need to wrap it. Then doing justified text is even more interesting, because you want to then, you basically work out how many words you can fill in a line and put the spaces in correctly. And you want to put more spaces but have to do a dot than maybe other places. So it's actually a really interesting challenge to get typography nice. If you go in Pro, you also want to think about the very last word in the paragraph. You don't want there to be sorting your lines and have one orphan, a single word. If you can help it, if you can space everything a bit nicer and not have an orphan, 2 or 3 words looks okay, but when you have just one word on the last line. So if you actually look at how when you're writing in a word editor, how it reorders the words above you and changes the space of the entire paragraph even though you're writing on a different line, it's an interesting challenge to do. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a pointer of my current position on this screen, and as I loop over these events, as long as I haven't hit the bottom of the screen, I'm going to add another line on to go downwards. So going downwards is easy because I know how big this is. I add on maybe another 10 pixels for the spacing between lines, and then it will space out nicely. Another thing that's interesting, I'm probably going to only work in capitals. I have descenders, and that probably has an impact on whether there's another line underneath or not, and the spacing. I just checked and there's not spacing. So that's basically the layout of what's going to happen. Let's have a quick peek at the code of how that gets put together. So I'm not going to go over line by line coding of this. I'm just going to go very quickly over how it works. What's interesting is we basically have to have 2 fonts loaded, because pygame loads the font at a particular size. I can't just load the font and then pick the size I want to use dynamically later. Because I know the size, I could actually change this to work out the height. Now this is the height in points, not the height in pixels. And there isn't actually a relationship between points and pixels directly, because no one knows how big a pixel is on the actual device. So you'd have to do a little bit of calculation, or you can guess. There's usually a pitch density, which is like a standard range. But there isn't actually an easy way of doing it. You'd actually have to ask the screen what its density was and sort of feed that back. I think you can do that in pygame. I haven't tried it. The moment I'm just going to hard code, it only has to work on this screen. I don't care if it doesn't work anywhere else. So I'm going to load the font twice, once at 144, once at 42. Because I'm going so big, I don't need to use the bold version. Using the bold version makes all the lines longer and wider. I don't need that. It's kind of good enough as it is. I'm doing that if the render is set to none, because after it's gone through this once, because it goes into the screen every loop round, it goes into this. I'm also using a next free refresh tag. So this refresh basically is refreshing once every 30 minutes. So basically, because these calendar events are in my diary, so as a calendar event, I'd have it on my screen, I'll have had to hit accept before it goes to my calendar. So I only actually care about refreshing every 30 minutes. Any faster than that, it's just a waste of resources. So the first time around, if the refresh is due, or any time I go around, if that basically is less than now on that frame, it will do a refresh, which will slow the frame down, because it's going to, like you saw before, it's going to take 3 or 4 seconds to run. You kind of don't notice in the big picture things. So basically what happens here is on the refresh, we are basically going to blank out the render. So I have a local render, which is basically an image canvas. Completely blank it out, just flatten it with black. I grab the current date time, but then render that date time using the big font. So I have basically a title font and the event font. Slap that in at 1010, top left, make it look good. And then what we're going to do is actually work out, I'm using this next vert, where on the vertical, where's the next line going to start at the top of that line. So basically, it's the height of that title block plus another 20 pixels. That's my spacing. Now, I think I tried 10 and it just didn't look quite right, so I just went back and tried a different number. So if it doesn't look right for you, and your font that you choose, just try different numbers. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to log online, and this is why actually I could use the trick I used with YouTube, where I actually cached that in a little JSON. I update it from a cron script. That would be nice. But actually here I'm using my credential system. I actually use a different credential system than I showed you. So it's just a file. But what's happening here is I'm basically saying every 30 minutes refresh my calendar in the main event loop, which is really inefficient. If it was a computer game, you wouldn't want to do that. Again, the same trick as before. This code here is basically the code you just saw, which is saying get all the events the next 3 days. The difference here, not having this print line, but having this append line. So I'm saying now, actually drop in to an object, an array, all the events. And then I go around and render them in. I didn't want to link these two together, just because at the time I was still thinking I could rip this out, but I didn't want to have my render logic too mixed up with my get data logic. Basically at this point what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a rendered text, which is the event data, which is basically just the event name. The event name being defined here as the time plus the subject. And then I'm going to add that in with the current event pointer. And then I'm going to add on to the event pointer the height of that rendered text plus another 10. So I'm adding on down that page every time. And then basically what I do is I get the current height of the rendered text. I've done the same line of code twice, you might notice. And the other thing I do is I check to actually see if... so I add this line here. It doesn't do anything. Don't worry about it. Just ignore that line. I didn't know. See, code review. This is why code reviews are super important, especially code reviews. Apparently I don't know where my hash symbol is. Apparently my hash symbol has moved. Which is most disturbing, because it should be there, and that is not my hash symbol. Something is going on with my keyboard. So I'll give it that line. And basically then what happens is we're going to go and check to make sure that we haven't gone off the bottom of the screen. Because if we have gone off the bottom of the screen, I can still keep on rendering. Pygame will let me. It's just inefficient. There's no point doing it. So if I happen to come back with like 1,000 events, the calendar's gone wrong, I don't want to crash my thing by loading all these events in on rendering them all. Just break out the for loop. Breaks out the for loop. This means that the render, this self.render, is set for 30 minutes. We render it once, and we actually render that once every 30 minutes. When we call render from the big screen framework, it's only going to basically say, is 30 minutes up? Otherwise, return the one I pre-rendered. So you end up with this really smooth transition, because of the transitions I did in the last episode, from this screen to the next screen and back again, because I'm not actually doing that on every revolution round. That concept of caching and only rendering stuff you need to render is what gets you really high frame rates, which gets you really nice, smooth transitions and animations. Being obsessed by framework, it's not, you shouldn't be sitting there going, oh, I need to be doing 60 FPS on these things, because they don't need it. but you should be watching your frame rate, because your frame rate tells you where you've got inefficiencies. So as your project gets bigger, it's going to get slower, you're going to have more inefficiencies. But if you suddenly leap from like doing 40 frames a second at your max speed, I know I've slowed this down to 15, if you're doing at 40 frames a second at your max speed down to 20 by adding a few lines of code, it suggests those lines of code are wrong. And I have had that. I added in our game that I'm writing with Tom, we added a chat box, and adding the chat box with a bit of alpha on completely slowed the game right down. It was still playable, it was still over 30 frames a second, but we realized we're really in the game development. We haven't done any of the other logic, we haven't done half the animation, so for just the chat box to slow it down so much meant we did the chat box wrong. We looked at the code and we had really misunderstood parts of the code when we built it. Anyway, the main point of this was show how to interact with MS365 and Exchange. Do a little deep dive into that, or even deep dive, a little lightweight look at the Exchange lib library. Show how you could use it in something like the big screen render events. This would be really cool if you have like a service account and a big screen. Maybe it's a church hall or something like that, and you want a big screen showing these are the events going on today, but you don't want to show a calendar, you actually want to show something a bit more interactive. I'm sure you guys could come up with a better thing. One thing is you could do, remember I said about it showing UTC and not GMT, it's something I haven't fixed here, but you also want to think maybe you can do, well, time until, so you can do now minus that and do a really nicely rendered 24 minutes until this next event happens. You can do things like trigger SMS alerts or trigger notifications or trigger voice alerts saying your meeting starts now, whatever you need to do from the back of this. So this is a really cool library. It's really tons of possible integrations. It's one of those things where what I like about this library so much is it takes all the complexity away. So you can really focus on building your application and your business logic and do something cool, rather than the ins and outs of how to actually authenticate with Exchange Web Services. Does it all for you. Go away, build bots, build big screen, build cool stuff, and let me know. So if you like this, please hit like. If you want to see more of these videos, maybe send me a comment. I'm on Twitter. But hit subscribe if you want to see more of these videos. That's all I can say. Any and all feedback is always graciously received, and we'll see you all in the next episode.